Hello and welcome to this week's edition of TRP News, a production of the United States Rational Progressive Party and therationalprogressive.com. I'm James Andre, and here's what's been happening this week. Last Thursday marked the start of the Iowa State Fair. The fair is expected to draw over 1 million people, and besides the standards of popcorn, hot corn dogs, and cotton candy, it also features pork chops on a stick, a full-size sculpted butter cow, and a multitude of presidential hopefuls. Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders made an appearance at the fair on Saturday. Clinton worked the crowd for an hour after holding a press conference and did not take the stage to make a speech. Sanders took the opposite approach, taking the stage and drawing what was reportedly the largest crowd of the day. The fair has an ongoing poll on attendees' preference for the candidates, and the current standings give Sanders the lead in the dim contest with 351 votes to Clinton's 273. The only person garnering more votes than Sanders is so far Donald Trump, with 408 votes. However, all three, and even the famous butter cow, trailed in the number of votes cast for most anticipated attraction, which was the food, with 944 votes. These and other fair polls can be seen at sos.iowa.gov/statefair. The fair runs through August 23rd. After attending the Iowa Fair on Saturday, Sanders made a Sunday appearance on Meet the Press. He was asked about an email which a campaign director made an apology to a group of activists involved in the Black Lives Matter movement. Marcus Farrell, a black and the Sanders campaign's African-American outreach director, wrote, "I apologize it took our campaign so long to officially reach out." This was widely reported in simplified and sensationalized style that typifies the political media as Sanders apologizes to Black Lives Matter. Of course, these types of headlines were inflammatory, as in the wake of the Black Lives Matter demonstration in Seattle, where a Sanders speech was interrupted, there's been a flare-up of white liberal racism and resentment. Not surprisingly, the news of the email and the appearance on Meet the Press served to stir the pot. And once again, black Americans were subjected to the indignant racism of so-called progressives across the internet. The comments were mostly repeats of the same old oppressive racial harangue that blacks have been listening to for their entire existence in the Americas. This time, of course, many were specifically focused on the outrageous and absurd idea that Sanders should apologize to black people at all. The comments like, "They owe you an apology, but they don't have the class. They acted like spoiled children. Sabotaging tactics. I'm sure they were promised something. I'm pretty liberal and was a bit sympathetic to their cause, but after that, not so much." They fail to see the lead issues Bernie is talking about are the bigger picture. And without white liberals like the Kennedys and LBJ, to mention only two, where do you think civil rights for black people would be? I guess giving your life is meaningless. You take much for granted. Your selfishness is disturbing. Of course, assuming that becoming the subject of national venom and criticism is somehow selfish. There is, however, some evidence that some are starting to get it and to speak up. Comments like protests from BLM are about making changes to tackle institutionalized racism, and they will protest wherever necessary to make positive change. And their protest was absolutely the correct thing to do. The Democratic Party owes a lot to black people who help us gain the White House through 2 elections. We owe them our support in their time of need. But Sanders seemed to put his foot in it again when discussing the apology email with Chuck Todd. When Todd asked Sanders To tell him about it, Sanders' reply was, "That was sent out by a staffer, not by me. And look, we are reaching out to all kinds of groups," seeming to distance himself from any special consideration of the Black Lives Matter movement. He also again associated efforts on racial justice with reformation of the criminal justice system. And I can't help feel, but this is myopic and a bit insulting, as if the entirety of racial injustice can be resolved through interactions with the police and the court system. When asked if he felt the apology was necessary, Sanders replied, "No, I don't. I think we're going to be working with all groups. This was sent out without my knowledge." So all blacks are criminals, and you disavowed the actions of your black director of African American outreach. Way to win the black vote, Bernie. A favorite enemy of libertarians and others on the right wing was in news this week. There is talk that the Federal Reserve may be raising interest rates in the near future. The Federal Reserve is the central bank of the United States. The Fed has a legal mandate to support maximum employment, stable prices, and moderate interest rates. In 2009, its duties expanded to include supervising and regulating banks, maintaining stability in our financial system, and providing financial service to various public and private entities. The Fed also conducts economic research and publishes reports. For depository institutions, they maintain accounts and provide various payment services, including collecting checks, electronically transferring funds, and distributing and receiving currency and coin. For the federal government, the reserve banks act as fiscal agents, paying treasury checks, processing electronic payments, and issuing, transferring, and redeeming U.S. government securities. It does not receive government funding, and the U.S. government receives all the system's annual profits. In 2010, the Federal Reserve made a profit of $82 billion and transferred $79 billion to the U.S. Treasury. To meet their economic mandate, the Fed uses several tools to influence financial activity. Open market operations, which involves buying and selling of bonds to influence the federal funds rate, which is the rate banks charge each other for loans, the discount rate, which is the rate the Fed charges banks for loans, and reserve requirements, which is the amount of cash that banks must have in reserve to cover their deposits. Banks like to have their money working for them, so they try to stay as close to the reserve limit as possible. And sometimes they don't have enough reserves and have to borrow. The first choice is to borrow from other banks because that is the best rate, the federal funds rate. The second choice is to borrow from the Federal Reserve, which is the higher rate, the federal discount rate or discount window. So why am I in this political news video going on about the Federal Reserve? Well, first, we all know financial policy is political. It impacts everything we do. Secondly, there is now a movement from some progressives to influence the Fed's rumored upcoming decision to raise interest rates. Because of the Great Recession, the federal funds rate has been near zero since 2008. That means banks are able to essentially borrow money for free. This is an effort to encourage institutions to continue lending so that the economy does not stagnate. When the Fed already has interest rates at zero, they have less control over the level of economic activity. That's why since the recession, many central banks have been pursuing a policy called quantitative easing. Quantitative easing involves the Fed increasing the money supply and buying up financial instruments like bonds, effectively lowering the cost of investment to financial institutions, encouraging them to invest and spend more money or make more loans. Some have called this printing money, but really, no one needs to print money anymore. A central bank can simply say they have more money and add it to the balance sheet. This is why you hear some calling for an audit of the Federal Reserve System. Personally, I think that is pointless. It's like, since the Fed is our source of money, it's like going to a well and asking if auditing for saying the well has more water. It always has more water until it doesn't. Now, we have been operating several years with this loose monetary policy, and some are concerned that inflation may become an issue. That is where the progressive campaign, apparently led by Robert Reich, has come in. These progressives are campaigning against a rate hike, saying that the Fed should wait until wages and unemployment improve before any hike, and that inflation can be dealt with after it occurs, not before. Reich has a video out which explains his position on this issue. Now, I have criticized Reich in the past over the simplification of issues, specifically in what I called his laughable video on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And while this new video is also a gross simplification, in this case I do agree with his ultimate message. The Fed should prioritize wages and employment over inflation. And yes, inflation can be dealt with when it occurs, not out of fear that it might occur. And I've said many times in this report that progressives need to concern themselves with aligning the priorities of government with their agenda. And this is a clear and simple case where that comes into play. While Reich's analysis leaves out a great deal, and any Fed rate hike will be a fraction of a percent, he is correct about which factors should be the greatest concern to the Fed. However, one thing to keep in mind, companies and financial institutions are making more money than ever. With loose monetary policy, banks are essentially able to borrow money and make a profit from it at no cost to them at all. So not only should the Fed rearrange its priorities, perhaps it's time to also rethink the kinds of tools it uses to keep our financial system stable. In the "I'm mad and you won't like me when I'm angry" news, Senator Elizabeth Warren and Senator John McCain have introduced a bill to reinstate the Glass-Steagall Act. The Glass-Steagall Act refers to four provisions of the Depression-era United States Banking Act of 1933 that limited commercial bank and securities firm activities. Critics of the 1999 repeal of the law under President Clinton say that the removal of the regulations led to a frenzy of acquisition that created the too-big-to-fail institutions responsible for the financial collapse that led to the Great Recession. On its surface, it seems hard to argue. The Great Depression led to the regulations, and we had a stable system for years. Regulations were removed, and we had a Great Recession. And while many place the start of the Great Recession at 2007, market observers will know that the markets began to weaken in January of 2001, less than 2 years after Glass-Steagall was repealed. So why am I critical of the effort to reintroduce the legislation? Number one, to me this is a glaring example of the worst kind of legislative thinking there is. This is the kind of lazy populism that is destabilizing our country and holding us back. A lot has changed since 1933. A lot has changed since 2007. This legislation is being billed as some kind of solution to too big to fail, but even supporters say it will not solve the problem. Also, we now have the Dodd-Frank Act signed into law in 2010. The law creates a host of new agencies and regulations as well as requiring more oversight. Dodd-Frank also creates the Consumer Protection Bureau and contains the Volcker Rule, which was fully adopted January of 2014. The Volcker Rule is a ban on kinds of speculative trading that economist Paul Volcker believes led to the financial crisis of 2007. So what impact will this law from 1933 really have today? Secondly, things do change every day. As such, we need forward-thinking legislation that takes that into account. We need long-range planning and flexible laws that can adapt to economic conditions. That does not mean pointing at low-hanging fruit and saying, big banks bad, Hulk smash. That means thoughtful analysis based on sound information. It means empowered federal agencies staffed with experienced and knowledgeable people. It means ongoing and responsive oversight. Legislation and politics in general, based on what sounds good and what feels good, is everything I am against. Yes, we need to do more to not only ensure the stability of our financial system, but to also limit the mercenary tactics of financial institutions that exploit the average consumer. For example, where did the limit on credit card interest rates go? The fact that some people are paying nearly 30% for credit card debt is obscene. Instead of bringing back Glass-Steagall, how about repealing DID-MCA? The Depository Institutions Deregulation and Monetary Control Act of 1980, overwhelmingly approved by Congress and signed into law by President Carter. The law allowed institutions to charge any loan interest they choose. So there's a lot to be done, but this populist, legislative, backwards-looking name-dropping is not productive, and I doubt if it has any utility. Amid the ongoing release of videos purported to demonstrate that Planned Parenthood profits on the selling of fetal tissues from abortions, calls have again increased to discontinue all government funds for the health clinic. Some have claimed that Planned Parenthood is profiting from abortions, but the full unedited video they cite as evidence shows a Planned Parenthood executive repeatedly saying its clinics want to cover their costs, not make money. Deborah Nucatola, the senior director of medical services at Planned Parenthood, is seen on the video during a lunch meeting on July 25th of 2014 with two people posing as employees of a company looking to procure fetal tissue for research purposes. In the edited video, Nucatola says the cost for fetal tissue specimens was between $30 and $100, depending on the facility and what's involved. The full video shows that after Nucatola mentions the $30 to $100, she describes how those amounts would be reimbursement for expenses related to handling and transportation of the tissues. Nucatola goes on to say, quote, really their bottom line is they want to break even. Every penny they save is just pennies they give to another patient to provide a service the patient wouldn't get. Of course, Republicans are not ones to let reality stand in the way of any excuse to force their ideology on the rest of us. The Republican presidential candidates accuse the organization of profiting from death and tragedy and selling body parts. Republican governors have made administrative efforts to stop the flow of money to the organization in their states. Despite warnings from the president that such efforts are illegal and would have serious consequences, Louisiana, Alabama, Arkansas, Utah, and New Hampshire, the one state where Bernie Sanders leads Hillary Clinton in a poll, may have moved to terminate Medicaid contracts with Planned Parenthood. This despite the fact that federal money cannot be used for abortion, and abortion is only 3% of Planned Parenthood services. The organization mostly provides STI, STD screenings, contraception, and cancer screenings and similar procedures. In the ongoing migrant crisis, which many are calling the worst since World War II, migrants are still being rescued from Mediterranean waters. Last Saturday, the Italian Navy reported that 40 migrants were found dead after suffocating below deck on a boat. The boat was carrying about 300 people and was overcrowded and starting to sink. Survivors of the hazardous crossing from Libya often tell how traffickers lock migrants in the hold, mostly black Africans, who pay less for the voyage. The Wall Street Journal reports that the fates of those crossing the Mediterranean are increasingly being determined by money, ethnicity, and religion. A firm that conducts investigations for the United Nations Refugee Agency said the historic migration wave reaching Europe was becoming intensely commercialized, with migrants being treated increasingly like market commodities, with a clear hierarchy based on means and nationality. European Union countries recently agreed to resettle some 32,000 refugees from Greece and Italy, but they would only do that for Syrian and Eritrean nationals. Recently, the Slovak government said it would only help resettle Christian refugees. Some are welcoming immigrants. The mayor of a West German town says he wants to take in more asylum seekers to boost his town's shrinking population and economy. Over the last decade, Goslar's population has dropped by 4,000 and is currently losing up to 2,000 people a year. Last year, the town took in nearly 50 refugees and 41 so far this year. But towns are allocated refugees according to a formal quota system based on population and per head tax revenues. So the bigger and wealthier a town, the more refugees it is obliged to accept. Quote, "This system is crazy because in big cities there is often a lack of housing, while in Goslar we have the space," Mayor Junk told The Guardian. Not all in Germany share his perspective. On August 29th, the far right plans to hold an anti-immigration rally in the town. And the New York Times is reporting that migrants are experiencing increasing levels of violence in the country. Rights activists are reporting arson attacks and other vandalism at housing for refugees. Through June, the Interior Ministry recorded 202 attacks on housing for asylum seekers, including attempts to render shelters uninhabitable through arson, attacks with stones, or other vandalism. Far-right groups have been holding increasing numbers of anti-immigrant demonstrations. The Courage Against the Right group has counted 89 such demonstrations this year. However, there are also record numbers of people volunteering their time, clothing, and money to help newcomers, and the German government, both nationally and on state level, has strongly denounced the attacks. So the worst migrant crisis since World War II continues, and 50 to 60 million people displaced, no home, no shelter, and nowhere to go. Subject to beatings, abuse, and exploitation at the hands of traffickers and other opportunists. Some dying in the holds of overloaded boats, inhaling water contaminated with diesel fuel and human waste. And meanwhile, politicians around the world try to divide them by race, religion, and economic status and motive, all the while preaching the religion of denial and exclusion and praising the benefits of walls and barbed wire. And that's all I have for this week. Thank you for joining me. I'm James Andre. Once again, you have any comments or questions, please hit me up in the comments below the video or in the comments on our website, therationalprogressive.com. You can catch us on Facebook or Twitter. Hit us up with a like on one or the other or all three. And thanks once again, and we hope to see you again next week. Take care.